Tale of the Butterfly and the Crane Short Stories by Lady Lily. All stories contained in this video are from my novel, The Tale of the Butterfly and the Crane. They are stories told by one of the main characters and are family friendly. The novel, as a whole, is not intended for children, although there is a censored version that does not contain violence or adult content. All stories contained in this video are copyrighted July 2021. No reproduction is permitted. Sharing is allowed without alterations to any of the content. Watermarks must remain and credit must be given to me. You can follow me and read more of my novels on Tapas. tapas.io/Lady Lily LADYLILY. Thank you. The Tale of the Butterfly and the Crane. There was once a small young crane that didn't know how to fish. No matter how hard she tried, she always failed. If she wanted to eat, she had to catch bugs or pick at fresh roots and greens. One day, as she was flying low looking for a bug, she saw a beautiful butterfly. She was mesmerized at how its solid black wings glistened in the sun as it flitted among the white flowers. She decided not to eat this butterfly. It was far too beautiful. She thought she would keep it instead. But as she flew closer, the butterfly dashed away in fear, and she fell to the ground. She tumbled over and over until she finally came to a stop, her wings spreading out around her and a trail of feathers to show her clumsy descent. As she lay on her back crying at the embarrassment, the butterfly appeared above her and stared for quite some time. She sniffed and watched as he landed on a tall blade of grass to get a closer look. "Go away," she sniffed, certain he was only there to tease her in her present predicament. The butterfly smiled at her shyness and replied, "I wanted to see if you were hurt and offer my assistance." The crane tilted her head over the grass where she rested and glared up at the butterfly silhouetted in front of the sun. "What could you ever do for me?" she asked in a huff. The little butterfly heard laughing near a tree and saw other cranes making fun of her. "Are you going to let them tease you?" he asked. She continued to look upward without moving, too afraid of doing something else foolish for their entertainment. "It's my own fault," she said softly. "I can't fish, and all I can do is eat bugs. Today, I couldn't even do that right." She let tears slide down her feathered cheeks and tried to ignore the laughter. "Can't fish," he repeated. "How could a crane not know how to fish?" She sighed and answered, "I'm afraid of drowning. When I put my beak in to catch a fish, I feel the water rush around and it scares me. I'm just a little crane, so it doesn't take much for my beak and nostrils to fill with water." The butterfly felt more pity for her now and asked, "Have you tried fishing in shallow water? A lot of little fish swim near the pebbles." "I'm too clumsy," she replied shamefully, though his compassion was beginning to put her at ease. When I try to catch them, my beak slams into the rocks and I get hurt. Sometimes my big feet get in the way and I slip on the algae. The butterfly looked over at the cruel cranes still making jokes and thought of a way to help. If he could teach her to fish, she would stop eating butterflies and perhaps even grow stronger and larger so those cruel cranes could never tease her again. If I promise to help you, will you promise not to eat me? He bargained. She looked over at him again as he moved closer onto her lower blade of grass. He was almost beside her eye now, and he looked even more handsome than when she first saw him. She nodded quickly and rose to her feet. But how was a little butterfly going to teach me how to fish? She wanted to know. Follow me, he instructed, and they flew together to the side of the stream. Wait for me here, he said. When you see a fish, do exactly as I tell you. She watched him fly out over the water for a while until suddenly he turned and raced back toward her. He was flying so fast, she wondered if he was going to fly into her face. At just the last minute, he flew upward and a large fish leapt out to grab him. Catch it, the butterfly ordered, and she caught it in her beak. Bring it back to shore, he ordered, as he flew back around. She did as she was told and quickly dropped it onto the rocky ground. The butterfly landed on top of her head as she stared at the first fish she had ever caught. I did it, she exclaimed. I really caught a fish. Do you want to catch another? The butterfly asked, and she eagerly nodded her head. They returned to the stream and repeated their fishing technique several times more until there was a large pile of fish on the rocky bank. The other cranes had come to watch and were amazed at her new skill. I'll share them with you, she told the others. This is too much for me. The other cranes looked at one another with guilt. They had always teased her and hurt her feelings, but now she was offering them these fish she earned herself. She pushed the fish in their direction when it seemed they wouldn't accept the gift, and they humbly took one each and flew away. When everyone was gone, the crane turned to the butterfly, fluttering around her head, and asked, Why did you help me? I might have eaten you like I have so many other butterflies, but you helped me. The butterfly rested beside her as she nestled into a clump of flowers and replied, I helped you so you would stop eating my kind, and you could properly feed yourself. She responded with a simple, quiet, Oh. And because you are the most beautiful crane I have ever seen, he continued. She quickly looked down at him as he perched on a flower. Me? She replied doubtfully. I'm not beautiful, she argued softly. I have no red feathers like the other cranes, and the feathers that are supposed to be black are dull gray. I'm also smaller than any other crane my age. I'm the ugliest crane in the world, she sniffed. The butterfly flew up to her beak and landed so she could see him. I may not know much about feathers and what other cranes your age are supposed to look like, but to me, you are the most beautiful crane here. When I saw you swooping down to catch me, I thought you were a heavenly fairy. At that moment, I was willing to be eaten if it meant I could be close to your heart. The crane's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever said those things about her. I wasn't going to eat you, she admitted. When I saw you, I thought you were too beautiful to be crushed in my mouth. I wanted to be your friend, but then I tripped and made a fool of myself. Before the butterfly could say any more, a star soared across the dimming sky. They both watched as it disappeared into the light of the full moon. Make a wish, the butterfly said, and they both closed their eyes and secretly prayed to the heavens for the same thing. They each wished that in the next life they would return as two cranes, or two butterflies, or even two humans, any form that would let them be together forever after. The Brave Scholar and the Baby Dragon. Do you want to hear a story of a princess and a brave scholar? She asked the children. It has monsters and a dragon, she added, to get the attention of the boys, who preferred swords and scary things. Yes, all the children shouted, and Mîn Jíng began. There was once a king who only had one child, a beautiful daughter. The princess was good to her father, but no matter how much he begged her, she always refused to marry. No one was good enough for her. Some were too poor. Some were even too rich. Some were too cruel. Some were too kind. Some were warriors. Some were poets. And all were not to her liking. One day, when the aging king was thinking of who would inherit the throne, he decided he would force her to marry. He sent out an edict to every palace and every village of his land. He said that the man who could slay the 3 monsters wreaking havoc on the world would marry the princess. Many men accepted the challenge, and the king awaited the arrival of his new son. Among the noble and gallant warriors was the scholarly son of an old retired official. He set off on the long journey to become a hero and have a royal wife. He first went to a village terrorized by a Lutwalong. It was fierce and devoured children straying too far from home. After setting a clever trap, he killed the monster with his sword. His next task was a seaside town being starved to death by a Yalmo. The insatiable water beast would destroy fishing boats and eat all the town's fish. The wise scholar set another clever trap and once again slayed the bothersome beast. Along the way to his third and final test to win the princess, he heard tales of the ferocious dragon that was almost as crafty as him. Not only had innocent maidens gone missing, but the armed soldiers and idle princes as well. The stories were so varied, the scholarly hero was baffled about how to set up a proper trap. As he was walking down the path to the town, he came across a small dragon. He stopped and stared as the dragon played with a leaf blowing in the wind. This couldn't be the dangerous dragon, he thought to himself. Looking around in fear of a bigger one, he saw there was nothing else around them. He looked once more to the dragon and drew his sword. "I am here to seek justice for your victims," he said in a deep, loud voice. The little dragon stared at the scholar for a moment before speaking. "You must have heard the stories of my deadly crimes," he said. The scholar raised his sword and was about to slash down when the little dragon said, "That wasn't me." Setting his sword down, the scholar asked nervously, "Then who?" "No one," answered the baby dragon. "Listen," he said as he hopped onto a big rock. "Maidens fall in love with men their parents forbid them to marry. They elope and their parents blame me. Warriors bring shame to their kings when they lose a battle, so the kingdoms blame me. Princes become unfilial and waste away their lives in brothels and gambling houses. Everyone blames me." The little dragon plucked a flower and ate it as the scholar thought on his words. "Is this true?" he asked in doubt, worried this little dragon was more dangerous than his stature would appear. "Every word," replied the baby dragon. "What about all the stories that have been told for generations?" wondered the scholar. "You're just a baby. You weren't around then." "Oh," said the baby dragon, "you must mean my father." At that, the scholar once again became frightened and held up his sword. The baby dragon laughed and told him, "He's been dead for many years." And once again, the scholar set down his sword. He breathed a sigh of relief and wiped his brow of the nervous sweat. He watched as the dragon ate another flower and looked him over carefully. "You didn't get that plump from just eating flowers," the scholar noted. "Of course not," the baby dragon laughed. "I'm fed well by my mother." Before the scholar could lift his sword a third time, the gigantic mother dragon dropped from the sky and burned him to a crisp. As Mîn Jíng ended the story, she let out a growl and pretended to grab at the children. They shrieked and giggled when she captured two of them in her arms. "What happened to the princess?" asked a little girl, followed by other children wanting to know the same. "She ran away with the matchmaker's husband," Mîn Jíng replied with a wink. The children laughed again, rolling on the steps around her. Bixié and the Yin and Yang. Mîn Jíng cleared her throat and straightened her back to be heard clearly. Shizhu hopped onto her lap, weary from her adventures around the new people and eating so much grass and fresh vegetables. "This is the story about a little Bixié and the Yin and Yang," she began. "There was once a little Bixié named Bixié that always seemed to have bad luck. Everywhere she went, rain would follow and cause havoc for the people. She visited one village and was followed by days of hard rain that caused flooding. She visited a kingdom the day of a royal wedding and brought about a torrential rainstorm that destroyed the ceremony before it had even begun. She visited a fishing village and caused water spouts that destroyed several fishing boats. She visited a temple, and soon after, a terrible thunderstorm washed away everything inside, never to be seen again. One day, Bixié was walking through the heavenly realm, pondering why she existed, if all she did was hurt humanity. She wasn't looking where she was going and accidentally fell from a cloud, landing onto the lap of Heavenly Lord Do de Tenjin. "Forgive me, Grand Pure One," she said nervously, and backed away to hide in shame. "Wait, little Bixié," the elderly deity stopped her. "What has happened to make you so sad?" Bixié looked down in embarrassment of her failings as a protector of good fortune. "I cause rain wherever I go," she said in tears. "I cause flooding and destruction. I'm not a good Bixié at all." Do de Tenjin looked at her while she cried, and said, "So you're the one creating all of those miracles in the mortal realm." She stopped crying and looked up. "Miracles?" she asked. "Yes, miracles," he answered. Then he explained. There was a village that hadn't received any rain for a year. The crops were dying, people were starving, and there wasn't enough water for the livestock to survive. You brought them rain, and now life is returning to the land. There was a plot to assassinate a king as soon as he was married. The sky opened and a terrific rainstorm washed away everything, causing the wedding to be delayed. When that happened, the plot was discovered and the king was saved. There was a fishing village that had gone months without a sustainable supply of fish. This village survived by delivering fish to other towns and to the palace. The fishermen tried every day, but there was barely enough to feed their families and nothing left to sell. One day, a big storm occurred out at sea, causing 3 waterspouts to emerge. Those waterspouts picked up thousands of fish from the deeper waters and dropped them near the land, where everyone from the village was able to collect them and salvage their livelihood. There was a temple infested with snakes for years. No one could use it to pray or to meditate or to honor and remember their ancestors. They tried everything in their capabilities as mortals, but could not rid the temple of the snakes. Then a storm came through, and the flooding washed every snake out of the temple for good. Bixié stared at the heavenly Lord in shock, and he told her, "Little Bixié, didn't you know to look for the positive when faced with the negative? You ran away as soon as you saw the terrible part, so you missed out on the good that came from it." Heavenly Lord lifted Bixié into his arms and carried her to a cloud shimmering with raindrops and glowing with all the colors of the heavens. "This is your very own throne now, Bixié," he told her. "Always remember the joy that comes from the storms you bravely endure." The General's Heart. There was once a strong and powerful general who was loved throughout the land. Books were written about him and stories told on the streets. He had many admirers, but none were as in love with him as the king's niece. She collected everything that had anything to do with the general. Her rooms were full of books and scrolls, paintings, and even wooden figurines. If a song was sung of his victories, she memorized it to sing for herself. One day, she heard an official had brought a complaint against the general to the king. He said the general was no longer needed, since his unmatched skills had won all the wars and defeated all the enemies. In fact, he claimed the people were afraid of such a powerful general with no enemies left to fight. When she heard the general would be questioned at a morning assembly in the king's meeting hall, she begged her uncle to let her attend. She wanted to meet him more than anything. He was against this, of course, but he doted on her more than his own children. He agreed, but on the condition she not make a scene. Just before the meeting was to begin, she walked up to an empty seat beside the king. With her were 2 servants carrying 2 boxes. She had them set the boxes in front of her as she sat down. She rested her head against her hand and looked at the general as if she were dreaming. Her smile stretched from ear to ear, and she sighed at his beauty. Across his left cheek was a long scar from a bladed weapon. Above his right eye was another jagged mark. His hands were weathered with scars from fighting, and his brow was creased into a serious scowl that began when he first put on a uniform. She sighed again as she thought of the bravery behind his survival and willingness to return to battle for the honor of his king and kingdom. She began to imagine what life would be like with a husband so loyal to her and courageous enough to fend off an army in her honor. As she was daydreaming, the voice of a snippy little man woke her. She stared down to see who dared interrupt her improper thoughts. "The people all cower in fear when he walks down the street, Your Majesty," the little man was saying. "He's a trained war dog with no one to fight but the kingdom's innocent citizens," he continued. "His own soldiers have become afraid to train with him because he's lost every ounce of civility. You must do what any responsible master does when their beast of burden becomes dangerous and obsolete. I beg Your Majesty to strip him of his rank and send him out of the kingdom for the safety of your people." She listened to the officials mumbling as if they disagreed, but were too afraid to speak out against the troublemaker. She looked at her uncle, the king, to see how he felt, and he seemed as confused as everyone about what to do with her general. Finally, she looked at the general and saw him standing perfectly still. He said nothing in his own defense. He only waited for his king to give him a command that he would surely obey because he was loyal to the end. Ahem! She cleared her throat and sat up properly. The general only moved his eyes in her direction for a moment before looking back at the king. "I don't know much about palace politics," she admitted, "or why someone like this little man who has never seen a day of war would slander the general. I can, however, hear and read. What I hear him say seems quite the opposite of what the people are really saying." The king was about to silence her, but his curiosity wouldn't let him. He was as loyal to his general as his general was to the crown. If his facetious niece could save the general, he would allow her whatever trickery she had planned. Everyone watched as she reached into the first box and pulled out a gossip sheet from the capital streets. "Our general has once again given our kingdom a victory," she read. "The general saved us from villainy," she read another. She took out yet another and read, "There is no greater savior for the people than our beloved general." "These were written in the last few days," she told them. "But little official says the people on the street are terrified of him." Everyone watched as she pulled a small stack of papers from the other box. Opening up a folded paper, she read, "The general saved our son when he blocked an arrow that would have struck his heart." She opened another. "General brought a wagon full of food to our small province when he and his soldiers saw flooding had washed away our crops." And another. "I owe my life to the general. Before I served him, I gambled and cheated and lied. The general made me work and train hard every day and taught me what it means to be a respectable and honest man. I now have a loving wife and 3 obedient children." When she was through reading, she kicked over the first box. Dozens of scrolls and gossip pamphlets spilled out onto the floor in front of the officials. She kicked over the second box, and hundreds of letters spilled out across the pamphlets. Turning her attention to the official, she said, "I don't know what kingdom little official has visited, but the words he heard against our general certainly did not come from here." She looked up at her uncle, and he winked. She looked at the general and smiled at him. She waited for him to give her some sign he was thankful, or even just a little impressed. But he remained stoic, his eyes still fixed upon the king. The official began to stutter. He tried to find words to argue, but the king had heard enough. He stripped little official of his rank all the way down to commoner and sent him out of the kingdom. The king called an end to the meeting and brought his niece to meet the general. She couldn't take her eyes from him. Though he didn't look at her, she still smiled and bowed politely. The general bowed to them both and left without a word to the princess. "He doesn't like to talk," the king told her, so she wouldn't be sad. "He's that way with everyone. Don't worry, I know he's grateful." He patted her hand and she smiled. "It's all right, uncle," she said. "I know he's eager to return to his duties. I have a plan to make him like me." She smiled and skipped away as the king shook his head in worry she would have her heart broken. The general was a perfect soldier, loyal, strong, heroic, and skilled. But he knew nothing about love and how to respond to a girl's affections. The king knew his niece and her determination to succeed in everything she did. All he could do was wait for her to face the reality the general was never going to love her. Then he would find a nice young man for her to marry so she could forget the general for good. The next morning, and for many mornings after that, the princess made breakfast for the general. It was her own special recipe that she didn't share with anyone, and she sent it to him as soon as she knew his day had begun. The next afternoon, and for many afternoons after that, the princess sent the general a special ointment for sore muscles. She sent it to him at the end of his training for the day. The next night, and for many nights after that, the princess played her guzheng to help the general fall asleep. She sat just outside of his courtyard and played tunes she had written just for him. After weeks of sending him breakfast, ointments, and playing her guzheng, she decided to meet him again. She rode toward the gates of his manor and saw him speaking to a woman a bit older than her. The woman was beautiful, and the general smiled at her. It was the first time the princess had seen him smile. She watched a bit longer, hoping it was a polite greeting to a woman passing by on the street. When the general pulled the woman close and kissed her on her forehead, the princess felt her heart break in half. She hurried home and cried alone in her room for the rest of the day and on through the night. By the next afternoon, she realized she had been foolish to believe in her fantasies about a man who had no interest in her. She had the servants put everything about the general in crates and move them to one of her uncle's storage rooms. The king soon learned about his niece's condition and went to see about her. She told him she was all right, that she knew she had to grow up and let go of certain ideas and dreams that could never come true. Her uncle asked her if she wanted him to destroy the crates, and she said no. She was sad about what happened, but the general was still the general. He was still a hero, and she would always see him as such. The king then asked if she wanted him to make a decree marrying her to the general. He didn't like seeing his niece in so much pain. She said no, she would never want to force him to marry her against his will. She made the king promise he wouldn't do such a thing, or anything else to hurt the general, who didn't deserve to be punished for her one-sided love. The king agreed, and their daily lives went back to the same as it had always been, except she had grown a little wiser and put away childish things. One day, the general began to realize something was missing. For many mornings he opened his door to find there was no breakfast from the princess. For many afternoons he returned home to find there was no jar of ointment on his doorstep. For many nights he tossed and turned and waited for the sound of the Princess Gúch'in that never came. He walked around the training camp and asked if anyone had seen the princess. No, he was told, no one had seen her. He began to wonder if she was ill or if something had happened to keep her away. He decided to ask the king. The king was a little surprised that the general was asking about his niece. When the general explained about the little things she had been doing for him, the king apologized. "I'm sorry she's been such a bother," he told the general. "But you won't be troubled by her antics again. She saw you with that woman and knows you have no affection for her." "She misunderstood," the general told the king. "That woman was my sister. Your Majesty, nothing your niece did for me was a bother." The king believed the general was only trying to be polite. "I appreciate your tolerance of my niece," the king told him. "Rest assured, your life will return to normal now that she has moved on." The general thought on the king's words and realized the last few weeks had become his new normal. He didn't want to return to the loneliness. He stood tall before the king and without a moment of hesitation declared his wish to marry the princess. The princess was in her garden reading a boring book about palace affairs when her servant ran to her with urgent news. The king, she was told, had decreed a marriage between the princess and the general. Instead of being happy, the princess angrily ran to her uncle's study to reject the proposal. When she arrived, the general was standing with her uncle. They appeared to be waiting for her. "I told you I didn't want this," she said to the king. "You promised you wouldn't force him to marry me. I won't accept." She folded her arms and set her jaw as she stubbornly waited for the king to rescind the decree. "Your Highness, I'm the one who asked to marry you," the general said to her amazement. She stared at him in surprise. The general took a step toward her and told her how much he missed her food, how his muscles ached for the ointment, how he couldn't sleep without her sweet music, and how he missed watching her sneak around his manor to do little chores she thought he didn't see. He even explained that the woman she saw was his sister, and he didn't care about anyone but the princess. The second time she saw the general smile was when he told her he needed her in his life. The third was at their wedding. The fourth was in their bridal room. And the fifth, and sixth, and seventh. The Three Little Rabbits. Once upon a time, there were 3 rabbit brothers. They left their home in the mountains to explore the world, and when they returned, they discovered 2 hungry wolves had moved into their territory. They didn't know how they were going to get past the wolves to get to their wonderful thicket. The first rabbit stepped forward. He told his 2 brothers, "I'm faster than those old stupid wolves." And before they could stop him, he hopped as fast as he could down the path to their den. Poor silly rabbit. Everyone knows wolves are faster. In less than 3 hops, the wolves had rabbit for dinner. The second rabbit looked around at their surroundings. "I know what I'll do," he said. "I'll use the path that goes through the snowy mountain peaks." He began to hop as fast as he could up the side of the mountain. Poor silly rabbit. Everyone knows wolves love to hunt in the snow. Now, the third rabbit was cunning and brave. He had watched his foolish brothers, who thought they could defeat the wolves on their own. he decided to get help from another forest creature. Luckily, he remembered where a giant bear lived. The third little rabbit waited until the wolves had picked up his scent. Then he hopped right past where the big grumbly bear was napping. Just as the little rabbit passed the sleeping bear, the wolves ran out to catch it. They were almost to the little rabbit when the bear awoke and let out an angry growl. The wolves quickly tried to defend themselves from the angry bear, but the bear was too big and ferocious. He killed those pesky wolves with one swipe of his giant paw. The third little rabbit was quite proud of himself. He now had the entire thicket to himself and no longer had to worry about the wolves. He was happy for a while, until one day a hunter entered his home. The little rabbit thought and thought about how he could get rid of this man. "I'm smarter than a man. I can beat him at a game of wits." He hopped onto a log and waited for the hunter to pass by. The hunter approached and started to draw his bow, but the little rabbit stopped him. "Are you really going to take such easy prey?" the rabbit asked the hunter. The hunter looked around and back at the rabbit. He asked, "Did you just talk to me?" The little rabbit smiled and knew he was definitely smarter than a man. "Hunter, I can see you are strong and brave and skilled. A man like you should want a challenge when hunting his prey." "What do you suggest?" asked the hunter. "Why don't we play a game of wits?" suggested the rabbit. "If I lose, you can kill me and have me for dinner. If you lose, you have to leave here never to return." The hunter thought for a moment. He was certain he could outsmart a dumb rabbit. He nodded and said, "It seems fair. When do we begin?" "Right now," the rabbit replied. The little rabbit set up a row of wine cups in front of the human and a row in front of himself. Then he took out a wine jug and set it between them. "The first one of us who gets drunk and passes out loses," the rabbit explained. The hunter looked at the cups and looked at the rabbit. "We can play, but how is this a battle of wits?" he asked. The rabbit shrugged his shoulders. "Does it matter?" asked the rabbit. The hunter thought a moment and asked, "No, but can rabbits get drunk?" "We do it all the time," the rabbit answered. "We eat fruit that's fallen to the ground and ferment it. You see us walking on wobbly legs. We're drunk." The hunter accepted this answer, and the rabbit said, "Let's begin." The rabbit filled their first cup with wine. The hunter smiled at how easy this was going to be and drank his down before the rabbit even had a sip. The hunter watched the rabbit curiously, as the rabbit only stared at him with a grin. "Why haven't you had any?" the hunter asked. "Because it's poison," the rabbit answered. Before the hunter could say any more, he fell from his stool and died. The Littlest Cloud. There were once 3 magnificent clouds that always competed to see who was the greatest. Their competitions entertained the gods and the immortals, as well as people in the mortal realm, who enjoyed seeing the changing shapes in the sky. During the New Year's celebration, they decided to do something special for the 3 pure ones. They made their gift-giving into another competition to see whose gift would be the favorite. The first cloud created a beautiful blanket of snow across a glorious field. It was the same field that the divinely pure Yin and Yang often admired from his seat in the heavenly realm. to resemble the pure enlightenment that springs forth whenever he creates a new being, the cloud said. The second cloud created a lovely rain shower over the mountain that was the divinely pristine Lingbao Tianzhen's favorite place to read. To wash the mountain clean, so the impurities of the mortal realm won't stain the Divine One's heavenly robes, the cloud explained. The third and most creative cloud formed a hole through its large body over the divinely knowledgeable Daode Tianzhen's favorite school. To provide light from the sun for the students our divine teacher will visit today, the cloud proudly proclaimed. At the end of the New Year festival, the three clouds waited to hear whose gift was the most loved and well received. The three pure ones sat at a table having tea, admiring the last lanterns of the night, while the clouds eavesdropped on their conversation. My flowers almost met a disaster today, Yonshi Tianzhen told them. A careless cloud released a snowstorm over them as they were finally beginning to bloom. Thankfully, a little cloud came and covered my favorite garden to protect it from the cold. My sacred book was almost destroyed today, Lingbao Tianzhen lamented. A careless cloud poured rain all over my favorite place to read. Thankfully, a little cloud came and covered my book, protecting it from getting wet. My students were nearly burned beneath the hot sun today, Daode Tianzhen complained. A careless cloud failed to cover the sun and its scorching rays. Thankfully, a little cloud rested above them and protected their delicate mortal skin. We should reward that little cloud, suggested Lingbao Tianzhen, and the others agreed. From that day forward, the little cloud was blessed to deliver rainbows to brighten the world. The three overconfident clouds learned that while good can come from bad situations, so can bad situations come from good deeds that are self-serving rather than selfless.